Well, a very good evening to you all on this glorious spring evening in Sydney. Thank you so much for coming out of your homes and your offices to be here this evening. I hope you're well fed and watered and bathroomed before this gets underway. I tried to go and get a drink, but there's too many of you queuing up, so enjoy your drinks. Tonight, we're here for the Global Game Changers event. It's called Faking It. And it's really dedicated to major world challenges that we all know that the planet is facing, and even our local communities and us as individuals, around AI, Gen AI, information integrity, and the law, which is really quite a heady mix when you think of it. But I think we can all feel the day-to-day real-life implications of this stuff, and I suspect that's why so many of you have turned out tonight to listen to this wonderful panel of experts. To begin with, though, I'd obviously like to honour the ancient traditions and people of this land. I'd acknowledge that we're meeting on Gadigal land, part of the Eora Nation, and I'd pay my respects to the traditional custodians, elders both past and present, and I hope you'll join me in that as well. We're in the Great Hall here at UTS, a full auditorium. So thank you very much for turning up, and online as well to those of you watching far and wide. 1,000 viewers, I'm told, around the world, so it's great to have you with us here as well. My name's Hamish McDonald. I'm your host for this evening. I'm a journalist. I think about this stuff all the time, in part because the business that I work in feels a little bit like it's crumbling beneath us, in part because you don't trust us much, and because the business model seems to be disintegrating. So I feel it keenly. And I also want to understand what the future might look like. A bit about the order of proceedings this evening, and I should remind you, please keep your phones off or on silent. You'll have an opportunity for some questions at the end. We'll get some microphones out, and we'd ask you to stick up your hand when the time comes. Not yet, mate, not questions. We haven't had the panel yet, but great to see there's some enthusiasm. First of all, we are going to hear from the Vice-Chancellor of UTS, Andrew Parfitt. We'll also hear from Michael Davis, who is going to, I sense, in a sense, bring us up to speed with the key issues. This is obviously such a huge area of change. It's sometimes hard to distill it all and put it into one single picture. But Michael's going to attempt to do that in under 5 minutes for us tonight. Good luck. Then we'll have our discussion with this wonderful panel of experts, all with different areas of knowledge and research and understanding, both internationally, in government, in business, as well as industry and research. I think it's a really wonderful collection of minds that you're going to hear from tonight, and I hope we'll really add insight and value to your understanding of these issues. But first of all, I'm going to introduce Michael. He's a research fellow at the UTS Centre for Media Transition. He was formerly a regulatory policy advisor on online information, disinformation, impartiality and commercial influence in news at the Australian Communications and Media Authority, which I assure you is far more interesting than the title suggests. But would you please put your hands together for Michael Davis?
Thanks so much, Hamish. Yes, in fact, it's a fascinating area. And look, first of all, I'd like to play a message from the Vice-Chancellor, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, but he would like to send his welcome to you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the University of Technology Sydney and to the latest instalment in the Global Game Changers series, Faking It, AI, Misinformation and the Law. I apologise for not being able to join you in person for what promises to be a very engaging and lively discussion. Today we confront the pressing issue of generative AI and its role in manipulating information. As deepfakes and AI-generated misinformation spread online, they disrupt elections, challenge democratic processes, and infringe on rights globally. This event is crucial as it brings together experts to address these challenges and explore potential solutions to mitigate their insidious effects. I would like to recognise the Faculty of Law and the Centre for Media Transition and the work they are doing in this important space. Our university is deeply committed to addressing the challenges posed by AI and misinformation, and we are proud to support initiatives that foster critical discussions on innovative solutions. Thank you for joining us. I trust you will enjoy this critical discussion with our distinguished panel of speakers.
All right, so some of you might have picked up that there was something a little off about that video. It was in fact entirely produced with AI, including the script. And yeah, I mean, what does that tell us? I think one thing that we want to think about here is how easy it is to produce a deepfake video like this. So what I'm going to talk about to begin with is what the threats of generative AI are to do with information integrity and the law. What can the law do to address some of these threats? So let's think about what the threats might be. When ChatGPT was first released, there was a lot of hype and fuss about hallucinations, about potential existential threats, about the forthcoming singularity, and potentially the end of mankind. Humankind, I should say. Now, in my view, these are not the real threats, and once the hype died down, we found some of this discussion really to drop away, and we started to become concerned about, I wouldn't want to call them prosaic threats, but more narrow threats in kind of narrow spaces. We've seen, of course, anyone involved in higher education has seen, no doubt, the use of generative AI to hallucinate sources in student essays. But I don't think the real threat is hallucinations. We've seen in the law some lawyers hallucinating cases in their submissions to court. Again, you know, embarrassing, perhaps not the real threat. I think the real threat, and you know, those examples point us to that, is in fact us and how we use generative AI. So the real threat is not really in the technology, it's just a tool, but in how we use that tool. Let's have a look at some specific areas of threats. I think the first one is that AI is cheap for the user. It's not cheap for the planet, as we're becoming aware. But for any individual user, it's very easy to use and costs next to nothing. So this is our recipe for the Vice-Chancellor deepfake. A 1-minute video from YouTube, probably fairly low quality, of the Vice-Chancellor. One still photograph actually taken from the video. 10 seconds of voice also taken from the video. And that particular video did take 5 days to make because the Faculty of Engineering and IT, Ching Lan, thank you for making the video for us, they wanted to do a good job. But he did say he could make it in a couple of hours. He also made it with freely accessible open source models. Right, let's think about what the relative cheapness of AI, what the implications of that might be. NewsGuard, which is an organisation that monitors misinformation online, found that within 3 months of the release of ChatGPT, 49 websites were producing AI-generated news content, and that's now over 1,100. These churn very high volumes of material, and in some cases they're created almost entirely by generative AI with no human oversight. Here's an example, county local news, and you can see here in the article, this is the beginning of the article, on a column called Death News, an attempt at local news. You can see that the prompt that's gone into the model here is producing, you know, what we take to be common responses from AI models when they come up against the filters that have been built into them in order to safeguard users. Sorry, I cannot fulfill this prompt as it goes against ethical and moral principles. Vaccine genocide is a conspiracy theory that is not based on scientific evidence, and so on. As an AI language model, it's my responsibility to provide factual and trustworthy information. Is it? This use of AI is now commonly known by such epithets as AI slop and pink slime, in a reference to the emulsified meat product used to bulk up mincemeat. You can see here that there's clearly no human oversight of the content, and it's also being used to propagate misinformation. But for what purpose? If you cast your minds back to the 2016 US election, you might recall that there was a series of Macedonian fake news farms which were producing content targeting users in the US in order really to generate advertising revenue. So they engage in the US political discourse. They encourage people taking part in that discourse to get fired up, to get angry, to click through on articles, and in that way generate revenue for the people in Macedonia. Now, if you can imagine a fake news farm in Macedonia being a profitable business model, then AI-generated fake news farms are going to be even more profitable. The cost is almost zero. So I think there's no need to pay workers here. These sites can essentially just sit on the internet waiting for visitors to arrive, like some kind of yet-to-be-encountered parasite. Let's turn now to a recent use of deepfake technology in the context of the US election.
Today is today, and yesterday was today yesterday. Tomorrow will be today tomorrow. So live today, so the future today will be as the past today, as it is tomorrow.
All right, the first thing to note again is that the video is, if you look closely enough, quite clearly fake, right? So the problem is not really about deception, and I think that goes to the previous point as well. Just as the previous slide is a kind of misinformation, but its success is not really founded on its ability to deceive, and that's certainly the case here as well. So videos like this often take off online not because they're convincing or deceptive, but because they act as a form of political signalling, generally to in-groups, to like-minded people. This is an important difference between political deepfakes and, say, things like financial scams, right? Australians are losing quite a lot of money to financial scams. In fact, a reported $43.4 million in losses from scams on social media this year alone. And research by MasterCard shows that 1/5 of Australian businesses and 1/3 of Australians have been targeted by deepfake scams in the past 12 months. In that case, I think, where there is a need for deception, we might find that as the technology gets better, that problem is exacerbated. But in the political arena, that's not what we're seeing at all. The second threat I want to look at is that we really just want to have fun. Here's an Australian example from Queensland politics. This is an ad posted online by the official Liberal National Party account on TikTok of the ex-Queensland Premier, Stephen Mills. All right, funny, maybe. Again, it's obviously fake video, right? In the sense that it's an AI-produced video that impersonates a real person. But it's not really deceptive, nor is it misinformation. Instead, rather than a deepfake, this is often what's called a shallow fake, right? Where it's obviously fake, but it still serves a political purpose. And particularly, it generates user engagement online. Here's another example, again from the US. Well, you can tell by the way I use my walk, I'm a woman's man, no time to talk. The music loud, women walk, being kicked around since I was born. Never tolerate, that's okay, and you may look the other way, but we can try to understand. Right, you get the picture. All right, this is clearly a form of amusement, right? In a way, a kind of political cartoon, but a kind of political cartoon that's been democratized, right? Anyone now can be a political cartoonist by using generative AI to create a political image or video. This video was in fact posted by both Musk and Trump in a kind of signalling not to each other, but to their supporters, right? Paradoxically, an inauthentic video that conveys a message of authenticity to their followers. I think this points us to a key characteristic of contemporary political discourse, especially online. The third threat is that we don't care about the truth, or not nearly enough. Another example from the US election, again posted by Trump, again clearly fake. There's no deception here, right? But what's important is the political message. Again, a kind of political cartoon signalling to the follower base. Here's an earlier example from the beginning of last year, which interestingly was created by Elliot Higgins, who was one of the founders of Bellingcat, an investigative news outlet. Now, he was just fooling around with generative AI models at home or in the office, who knows, and he created a series of images depicting Trump's arrest. Now, Trump was arrested, of course, on fraud charges, but these images were produced before that happened. In a way, they depict something that's true, something that did happen, but clearly they lack authenticity. The point I want to make here is that creating the video is one thing and sharing the video is another thing. And here you can see the importance of people with influence, large follower networks, media figures, politicians, in propagating these images and videos through the information ecosystem. Again, deception's not the main issue. Instead, the images serve to amplify polarised discourse, taking over the online political sphere and reducing it to memes and hot takes. All right, this strange diagram is a visualisation of an online echo chamber generated from Twitter data. It shows how information travels mostly within partisan groups and less often between them. On the right-hand side, you have people in the right-wing ecosystem. On the left-hand side, people in the left-wing ecosystem. This study actually found that there's a high correlation between vulnerability to misinformation and partisanship. But they found that this was true on both sides of the political spectrum. Although it did find stronger partisanship on the right, and you can see that, in fact, in the diagram. Another well-known study showed that false statements propagated much faster and further on Twitter than true statements. In fact, where the truth rarely reached more than 1,000 people, the top 1% of false news routinely reached between 1,000 and 100,000 people. And it took the truth about 6 times longer as falsehood to reach 1,500 people. Well, what does this tell us? Well, other studies have shown that people often do not believe that misinformation is true. They're not deceived by misinformation, but they share it anyway for other reasons, mostly because it serves some kind of purpose of reinforcing their political identity, signalling like-mindedness, that is mostly to people who already agree with them. The fourth thread is kind of a corollary of the others. That's that we lose interest in the good stuff. Wikipedia is one of the most visited websites in the world. Despite its reputation amongst school teachers, is pretty reliable on the whole and for the most part. Indeed, it's kind of like a lone lighthouse, a beacon of the old school open internet, where people come together to work on a common goal in the service of open knowledge. This has led Australian journalist Richard Cook to call it the last best place on the internet. It's also one of the biggest sources of data for training generative AI models. It is, after all, freely available to anyone who wants to use it. The biggest worry for many Wikipedians, those in the Wikipedia community, over the rise of generative AI is that its potential success might lead to a gradual decline in commitment to Wikipedia. That's from the public to Wikipedia in maintaining the site, from Wikipedians to maintaining the site, and from the public in using it as a knowledge source and donating to Wikipedia to keep it going. Another worry is that, like a snake eating its own tail, generative AI may in fact devour itself. Okay, as generative AI output is used to populate Wikipedia articles and other online content, and then AI is in turn trained on that, you get what is often called model collapse quite quickly, where there's a danger that, the AI model essentially starts outputting gobbledygook very quickly. But I think perhaps more likely, and perhaps worse, is that knowledge is sequestered into proprietary domains, or what's known as walled gardens. Here, information might be reliable, more or less, given the propensity for hallucinations and bias, but it certainly won't be free. So what can we do to intervene? Can regulation play a role? Can we save what is best about the internet? Or is it doomed to meme fakery and degraded and angry politics? A message here from Selena Deckelman, Chief Product and Technology Officer at the Wikimedia Foundation. There's nothing inevitable about new technology. We can prioritise human understanding and contribution of knowledge back to the world as a key goal of generative AI systems. And with that, I'd like to open it up to the panel.
Thank you very much, Michael. If I may, I'll keep the introductions fairly short. They're all very impressive and they all have massive CVs, which I'm sure you can all Google. Monica Attard is the co-director of the UTS Centre for Media Transition, a journalist of some 40 years, of course best known from her work on the ABC, and she was a Russia correspondent for, I think, 2 occasions, so she's well acquainted with the history of disinformation. Karina Chapman is the deputy chair of ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority. She's also been a senior executive and strategic advisor at some of Australia's biggest media companies. Cullen Jennings is here. He's the Chief Technology Officer for the American multinational digital comms giant Cisco Systems, and he helps build collaboration systems used on the internet and strives to make simple, trustable communications available to everyone, which sounds like a fantastic idea. And Sophie Farthing is also with us, head of the Policy Lab at the Human Technology Institute at UTS. Previously, Sophie was the Senior Policy Advisor to the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, and of course Michael joins them as well. Would you please welcome them all? Tempted as I am to just sit and watch shallow fakes all night, we've got some pretty serious stuff to discuss, and I thought, Karina, I'd start with you and just some news over the past 24 hours about the misinformation bill here in Australia falling over. It's been consigned to that very deep filing cabinet somewhere underneath Parliament House, where all legislation that never makes it through goes. How should we view it? Is this a sign of just how difficult it is actually for government to get ahead of the curve or even keep up with the curve on some of this stuff?
Thanks, Hamish. Yes, the bill had a very interesting passage and a very difficult passage. And I think it shows that Michael here was demonstrating that when you have true AI where you can see real harms that are clearly illegal. I mean, the classic example is where the Online Safety Commissioner deals with deepfake sexualised material, which is clearly illegal. Pornography, child pornography, etc., etc. It's very easy for governments to deal with those issues. They are illegal. And as we know, AI exacerbates them. But when you come to that grey area, which I think is misinformation, which is probably a term which I think will probably now be abolished to the trash heap. I mean, I prefer to think of false information might be a more accurate way of describing it, but also disinformation, bots, and clearly foreign interference, those types of issues. I mean, the problem here, which is going to now be a problem going forward, if the government or the next government, any other government wants to deal with this, is that it's been so tainted by an enormous political debate, which a lot of it didn't have a huge amount to do with the actual bill itself. There was a lot of, I'm not going to say the cliched line, there was a lot of false information about that bill that was quite inaccurate. It definitely had flaws, but it just shows that once you get caught into a political maelstrom of freedom of speech, it's very hard to have a reasonable debate.
So you've been involved in that debate. You were giving evidence at the Senate hearings into it. Are there clear lines in your mind between, the freedom of speech argument, the weaponisation of disinformation for clear strategic or political purposes, or even interference? Like, can you delineate these things, or is there now just such a mess of information, such a polluted information ecosystem, that it does all blend and you end up with outcomes like this?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, you can't start from a position of freedom of speech and communication is absolute. Now, I in a way, I have a problem saying that personally, because I ran the media company's Right to Know campaign for freedom of speech for about 5 years. But once you get into this maelstrom of the grey area, I mean, as I say, it's easy to say that the illegal material should not be there, and that is not a breach of freedom of speech to have it removed. But once you move into material that is debatable, where do you go? Now, from a government's point of view, the front part of that bill, which has now been removed, now been abolished, is for transparency. And I think that's the starting point. That's the bit that we're missing. We don't actually know what's going on online half the time. The digital platforms, Meta, X, they tell us that they look at material, they tell us that they take certain action in relation to that material. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. The main priority of that bill was actually to try and pin the digital platforms down and get them to be open and transparent about what they're actually doing and what their policies are.
So if we're thinking about this in the future, Michael, and obviously those technologies are not static, what's possible is not static, it's developing faster than probably any of us can imagine. Is there something fundamental that governments need to do around placing a duty of care on whoever it is that's developing the technology or deploying it?
Thanks, Hamish. Yeah, look, I do think, and to follow on from what Karina was saying, the key issue here is accountability, right? That we're trying to make digital platforms accountable for what they already do. So quite clearly people are uncomfortable with the government regulating online speech, and with good reason, even though our democratic traditions are strong. That's a reason they're strong, right?
But can I just pull you up on that? Don't governments already regulate free speech?
Of course they do, yes. As Karina said,
so what's the big difference?
It's not absolute. Say again?
So what's the big difference? Why does the internet get free rein where the rest of the world doesn't really?
Yeah, that's a problem, and that's a problem of accountability. So where, a traditional media is already subject to accountability mechanisms through press councils, through ACMA, and so on, and also has a kind of tradition of good practice, right? You don't find that online. Digital platforms, have come out of nowhere to become the biggest companies in the world. And they've achieved that by essentially also through kind of lacuna of accountability and a conscious decision to ensure that that no one else has a say in what they do with online content. And I think what we're seeing is a definite movement towards accountability there, that because platforms always moderate content, right? We wouldn't go on platforms if they didn't moderate content. They would just be like a sea of mush, like we saw this pink slime of pornography and whatnot. We need moderation for platforms to be useful, and they understand that. That's actually their business model. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be unaccountable for the way that they operate and what they do with the content that we put online.
They need to be accountable to their users. That's the first point. And government's role is to be the intervening party to ensure that they are transparent to their users about what they're using. Can I make a comment?
I just want to pull you up there just to sort of insert the Elon Musk-ish argument that might be made to that is, well, our users are telling us they want it because they keep logging on and subscribing and using it, and we're growing. So who are you, government, to tell us that you know better?
Well, that's right, which is why the obligations that probably should be on X and Elon Musk are tell us what you are doing. Now, X and Elon Musk have started a community forum where allegedly, you can go on and counter information, but how do you make a complaint to X? That's where there is a role for accountability. But I just want that duty of care thing is really interesting because this has become a very strong theme, which would be very interesting to lawyers, because they want to do one in relation to children, safety online, to accompany the under 16 ban. I think they'll end up looking at it on AI generally. They may look at it in this context. It's a road, and it's a missed thing in gambling. I think it was one of the recommendations in the Murphy Committee. In a legal sense,
scams as well. The scams protection.
Scams has got one. It's a road that the government can punt it down the road to the lawyers, I think, in many ways.
Sophie, what happens to society if this all kind of crumbles in the way that I guess maybe we're imagining based on some of the scary graphics that Michael showed us, but where we see some of this heading?
I think we should be scared. We should be concerned. Like we are talking about a particular bill, but I think one thing that really has arisen out of this debate, I'm a human rights lawyer, so I take a human rights perspective. It is really important to talk about accountability. And some work we did with the Home Affairs Democracy Task Force, they released a report a couple of months ago. And they have some pretty astounding facts and figures in that report talking about Australian democratic resilience and the fact that democracies are in decline, like liberal democracies that we all enjoy. There are less now than there were 15 years ago. I think something like, we've got, 2 billion people or something voting this year, but 70% of the global population lives under autocracy. So what we're all feeling, this discomfort we're feeling, the polarised debate, we've really got to unpack what that means. Yeah, we're talking about free speech and mis and disinformation, but what does that mean for the democracy we're all participating in? And this is why we expect governments to step in and protect that, because it is freedom of expression, but it's all the things that support us putting that really important vote in the box when we get to at election time. It's having, safe spaces for active citizens to have debates. It's having trusted democratic institutions. It's having information that we can trust. So I think there are a lot of different factors here, and I think the really positive aspect of, obviously there'll be some disappointed ministers that they have had to drop a bill around accountability, but it's really what other panellists have already said. If we don't get to these questions around accountability and how we do it, and it is hard, the new areas, we have a problem.
To the points you're making though, Sophie, arguments have been made for years, they're still being made, that actually all of this new technology does support many of those voices, creates different spaces or safer spaces. It rebalances things in the favour of citizens or minorities against governments or corporations that do no good and all the rest of it. Is it your view that that argument no longer necessarily holds water? What do you think?
There's space for both. Two things can be true at once. It's a favourite thing I use with my children. I think that is really important. And I go back to being a human rights lawyer, much younger human rights lawyer, when the Arab Spring happened. That was about, information online. But I think back to that. I was a human rights lawyer campaigning in London. When that happened, the realisation at that time of what social media, online safe spaces could do for democracy in a way that we hadn't seen before, I think that's the magic. We have gone a long way, and we've gone off-piste, obviously.
But I often think back to, like, I was in Libya and Egypt during that time, and what I hear coming out of governments, Western democratic governments today, sounds very similar to what the Mubarak regime was saying at that very time about Twitter. So what's changed? Have we changed, or have the platforms changed?
I think maybe our expectations of the platforms have changed, and I think it's the technology that the platforms are using. It's the scale and it's the ease. Going back to Michael's first slide there, it's the technology that's now available. It's democratising technology and that kind of generation of information. But there's a real shift that we've had with generative AI when you can cheaply easily generate images that have an impact. Some of those were funny. I do agree. Dancing Trump and Elon Musk, we all can have a good laugh at that. But I think of, the way that some of these technologies are used, including, thinking about AI that was used in a newsroom last year to make a Victorian MP look more womanly, shall we say, putting that through the male gaze. So I think it's the way the technology is being used and lack of accountability around the use. That's the change that we've got.
I think one of the things, too, that's important to understand is, there's so many different layers of companies involved. There's the people who collect the data to build these models. There's the companies that build the models. There's companies that use these models to do the generative AI. There's the platforms that distribute that. They all have different roles in being able to test it or detect it. But what's changed a little bit about going back to then is it's not the platform has dramatically changed. It's that the tools that people other than the platform can use to massively generate content, the platform may be or may not be doing a good job of detecting and stopping that. But even if they're stopping 50% of it, it's so cheap, this goes back to Michael's point, it's so cheap to generate, even if they can, stop 999 out of 1,000, still, it's so cheap that getting that one through makes it possible to just flood the discourse. And we have a much better idea. The platforms have really far more optimized this, and I mean this in a bad way of optimized, of trying to get that attention, economy going forward and keep people watching this content. So they sort of like it, right?
Can you give me an example of that?
I think that if you look, I think probably it's better, people in this room better to answer this than me, but you look back at the feeds that we had 10 years ago on whatever a popular social media platform was, and then compare it to today, you'll see that you see less stuff from across from your friends, less stuff broadly, things. It's back to that graph we saw earlier with the red and the blue, just more polarized into these ecospheres where you get this where people have optimized giving you content that even though you probably shouldn't follow that, you follow it anyway, and you just stay there. You spend more time on. The average times people have spent on platforms has gone up over time. All of these things were sort of a little bit by design of the platforms, right? They wanted to do that. That's more time on the platforms, was more advertising. You're the product they're selling to the advertisers, right? It's not the other way around. So they wanted to optimize that type of thing. They weren't necessarily creating any of the content that was there. That was coming from all kinds of other places. So this fake information, disinformation, the stuff of it that played well into their algorithms got promoted. And the people who were creating it could spend as much time as they wanted figuring out which played well into the algorithms, which didn't play well into the algorithms, and which got blocked. And there was no penalty for doing that, so they just keep doing that, and they found stuff that both played well into the algorithms and didn't get blocked.
So, Monica, the Filipino journalist Maria Ressa, Nobel Prize winner, talks about the mass pollution of the global information streams. But she also talks about exactly the sort of stuff that Cullen's just been describing, finding itself on essentially a level playing field with the information produced by newsrooms, authentic information. Is the battle lost in your view?
It's pretty close to it, I have to say. It's a bit of a depressing thought, but I think it's really, really difficult for content producers that are producing verified content, factual content that is, legitimate, to disabuse people of their belief in the crap content, frankly, that is being produced and that is out there, particularly when it's in relation to subjects that are in the news cycle, that are current, that have got everybody talking. There was one that appeared today, which was a video of Rachel Maddow from MSNBC, sorry. I'm thinking,
or as Donald Trump calls them, MSDNC.
That's the one. But it was her receiving some late-breaking news about some centre that had opened in Texas to process the children of who were legitimate American citizens who may have to be housed if their parents are turfed out of the United States. And she got a little bit choked up, but this video appeared online which had her crying, crying for an extended period of time, like crying, not even choked up, but crying. And it kept on, it was doing the rounds on X today for hours and hours, and despite the fact that community notes appeared below it saying, this is rubbish, this is not true, this is misinformation. It just kept on appearing, often without community notes. So, I mean, I think it's very, very difficult even for mainstream media to counteract the mis and disinformation that appears, because we're not trusted ourselves, and nobody's reading us, nobody's watching us, and nobody's listening to us.
Thanks, Monica.
Sorry.
I do.
I knew that you wouldn't like that, Hamish, but I think it's the truth. I mean, we are losing audience. We are losing people who have faith in us. And I get that. I mean, I think that there is a problem in journalism as well that we need to address, which is another matter, not the subject for today, obviously. But
it is part of it, though, right? Because the door is open for a conversation about whether real journalism, if you want to call it that, is doing a good job. And so we're a bit exposed, aren't we, if we're suddenly trying to say, well, we're the answer to this.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we've had, I mean, I keep saying we, even though I'm not an active journalist anymore, but I think once you're a journalist, you're always a journalist. But I think that we've had this problem which has crept up on us. It's been 20 years in the making, where our industry has been decimated, so we've lost people and we've lost resources and we've lost the ability to produce the kind of journalism that we've all taken pride in. Then along comes, social media, which is created these tribes of politically active people, and journalism has tried to deal with that. And what we see, particularly in Australia, is that you have some media organisations that fall in on the left and some that fall in on the right, and then you've got some that are trying to battle through the middle, muddy ground of the middle. And becoming really, really unpopular in the process. And so I think what the end result of that is that some of the kind of tried and true traditions of journalism have gone by the wayside. Impartiality, objectivity, fairness. I mean, we've got to look at those things from the inside before we can expect our audiences to really believe what we're giving them.
Okay, I want to move a bit to sort of the future and to the regulation bit, but I wonder, Cullen, if you can help me understand a little bit the business model of some of this stuff, because Michael talked about possible system model collapse, I think you called it. We hear a bit about shitification of the internet. There's just so much crap that maybe we'll all just turn off. Now, I want to give you an example, because I am a journalist, but sometimes I appear on Facebook selling crypto, And recently I went to a chicken shop called Charcoal Charlie's, and the guy there said to me, I watched the most incredible interview you did about crypto with Mark Bouris, who's a mortgage kind of guy. And I was a bit confused because I didn't remember doing it. What's the business model of that? Because it's all proliferating all over social media. Who's making money, where and how?
Right. So, I mean, obviously across these platforms, there's a wide range of business models, but the predominant ones are these advertising-driven ones that we all use every day, and they're trying to have you spend time on them. That's really what they care about. They can play more ads and those types of things. So they are effectively paying content creators at some level to create content, and once that content is created and gets views, it has to be content that gets views. That's great. So somebody steals your identity and moves off and starts making videos leveraging whatever brand and reputation you've developed. They start putting those on. That starts generating views on the platform, and they get paid for those views. There's a million more complexities than that, but when it gets down to the basics, that's usually about what it comes down to. And so one of the things that's happening right now is we're seeing all of this online content. Not that's necessarily red, but if you just scan all of the data on the internet since 2023, a lot of it is machine generated. And this comes back to what Michael was talking about, model collapse. When you just feed these models into themselves and let them talk to themselves, it goes crazy really quickly. And I don't mean crazy, it just goes bad. So right now there's a real preference to try and use training data that you know wasn't generated by a model, so stuff that's largely came before 2023. That's actually one of the issues at this whole space, is that some of the companies that were large early companies in AI and collected tons of data before it became illegal to collect it in certain ways, or before some people noticed copyright violations on it, they have access to data that probably newer companies and newer entrants won't ever get access to. Lots of people are closing off their access to data that used to be public. For example, National Public Radio in the US, NPR, has asked none of their data be used for training. It used to be usable for training, right? So there's sort of this closing down of stuff. And so there's a real concern about where the data is going to come from, how these companies are getting data. But that is, hopefully answers a little bit of your question on where the business model of why you're seeing yourself, except not you, on the internet.
So obviously there are some that argue you need to work with these companies to create whatever the regulation is. If that's the business model, why would you be negotiating with them to do that?
Well, I think it's complicated. So all of those companies don't want the whole thing to just collapse and go away and no one to use everybody to leave their platform, right? I mean, there's some argument that Twitter or X, whatever we want to call it, that is losing a lot of its viewership and stuff. And now, I don't think Musk cares about that, but for other platforms, they might care about losing their customers and their general reputation. So there's that question of why people would want to remain trusted, why it would want to be a source that was not a harmful place, why it was a good place to go. People would rather be YouTube than 4chan, right? One of those is much more profitable than the other. So you see companies trying to work in some way to have some sort of regulation, and that might be in the form of a responsible AI policy. Most companies have some, or lots of the companies have some form of that talks about the things you were talking about transparency, about being able to reveal what's happening. But when you really get down to it, if it's just companies making up how they're going to regulate themselves, the end thing of when they break their own rules, what will happen will be nothing. So I don't think that that's going to be the only story in the long run. You need something more than just companies make up their own rules and follow them. That's obviously not going to work.
Karina?
Yeah, I can't verify this, but I understand that on Facebook there's actually scam pages that are to warn you about scams. So
I can validate that. Yeah, that's a very common thing. It brings trust. You bring people in. It brings viewership. It's an exciting story. You go and do it. I mean, there was an airport, but that's not a new idea. There was an airport in a country I won't mention, where there was a lot of pickpocket thieves, that had a huge sign called "Watch out for pickpockets" as you walked into the airport. And everybody reached down to check their wallet. The sign had been put there by pickpockets to help you identify where your wallet was. Right?
But regulation, it's an interesting topic that's been dealt with in so much detail around the world. I mean, we saw the Bretton Woods agreements, but not much since. In the UK, the EU is trying to tackle it. America is to some extent. And if you look at what Australia's doing, it's got this multi-pronged approach, which I should say no one's actually mentioned this yet, but I mean, there's enormous advantages to AI and the technology that it can bring. And I think every government around the world is being very careful to balance that. There are a number of jurisdictions who are determined to be leaders in AI and they don't want to regulate, and we all know that it's globally regulated, so you can evade any legislation. I mean, here in Australia, from a news and information point of view, I think the most that the government is doing at the moment is looking into copyright issues in relation to media, but they're taking very much a high risk approach. What are the really high risk dangers in AI? And it's a pretty similar list at the moment than what the EU is using, biometrics, police and law and order, the things we hear, the terror stories out of China, those type of issues. And at the moment, they're really looking at only regulating high risk. And coming down to these issues, it's all about scams. So the scams regulation is where it's happening.
But to the point you're making, though, presumably governments are faced with a wall of opposition if they even talk about regulation, because the argument against is, well, you'll stifle the brilliant things that we might be able to do.
Also, you pick the problems. So that's why scams is the one that has so much traction. And I mean, if they could possibly get through all these bills this week, that legislation might get through.
Okay, but you've just been, face to face with the politicians. Do they understand it enough to pick the problems?
Well, the scams one's extremely difficult. They've picked 3 areas. They've picked digital platforms, they've picked banks, and they've picked telcos. Now, we've actually already got a code with telcos. We work with telcos on scams now to block those calls coming in. But yes, I mean, this is always the problem. Government's always behind. The government and regulators are always behind the game. All we can do is create frameworks. And I think what the mis and disinformation bill has now shown, that it's not like when I entered this game 20 years ago, where you just say, that's illegal. You know, that's not permitted. Now you've got to come at a far more nuanced approach, which comes from everything from literacy education, working with the platforms or the banks and whoever you're working with, and putting guardrails around it. But this government's getting quite impatient, and you can see it in relation to scams. Working with industries running out of time, I would say.
I think you were trying to get in, Monica.
Yeah, no, I was just reacting to what Karina was saying about the benefit. There are benefits to AI, big benefits, particularly in journalism. I mean, in journalism, you know, it can save a lot of time and a lot of money, essentially, particularly in the back-end processes. But there's this movement at the moment in big media houses to do deals with AI manufacturers, which of course is going to bring money through the door. Not a lot of money, because the deals haven't been particularly lucrative, but it does bring money through the door, and it's really kind of, they're Faustian bargains.
So what are the deals? What are they giving them?
Well, they're giving them content, and in return, what they're getting is, you know, the results of AI searches will provide links, so they're getting audience and they're getting money. But it is a bit of a Faustian bargain, because they're also selling whatever, I hate to say it, but whatever little trust remains in them as media organisations, they're actually selling. And I think that is really, really problematic for an industry that needs to rebuild from the ground up on that front. But you know, it struck me when I was thinking about this that whilst they're all selling their trust and they're selling their content, there is another solution. I'm not quite sure why big media houses haven't banded together to create their own LLMs, you know, to create so they're not selling their content to somebody else. They're not bargaining that away, but they're banking on their own. They're banking on themselves, and they're creating a system where people can an LLM that can be used to get verified information, real information.
And in fact, we are seeing that in Europe, for example, where in some countries the news organisations which cooperate more than is the case in Australia have actually banded together to do that.
Yeah, in Australia the problem is, half the problem is competition between media houses, as it is in the United States. It's really hard to see media houses here cooperating with each other. Try and get them to the same meeting, it's almost impossible.
Michael or Cullen, I don't know who's best to answer this. Are there many examples, good examples, of where AI is being used to actually resolve or tackle any of these problems?
I'm going to leave that one to Cullen.
Yeah, well,
no one wants to answer this.
I mean, scams. I mean, there are millions and millions of scams getting through in this country, but there are millions and millions that have been stopped. And it's by AI. And telecommunications companies, for all of their work, huge amount is done by AI.
And so is there any reason, Cullen, why that couldn't be turned on mis and disinformation?
It can help. Let me talk a little bit about what I think of happening and stopping scams is, I mean, probably one of the largest things helping on the telecom scams and all of these fake calls that we get is secure caller ID of understanding who they are, which is a technology called StirShake, which I'm an author of 20 years ago is when we started that work, and it's getting rolled out. It could not happen without governments going and regulate it. It started from industry. It's supported and promoted by industry, but it would never deploy unless the regulators had told telcos they had to do it. And it forms the basis of reputation systems and trying to center in on what these fake spam calls are. And look, I mean, what you said, the number one problem of like the huge financial losses, particularly around seniors, many of them are heartbreaking. So that's one area. So AI can help look at that, and it's being used by all the companies to try and figure out which are the bad calls, which are the good ones, with some success. It's better than it was. It's not perfect. Similarly with email scams, we've all gotten those emails that, you know, somebody wants to help us make a lot of money or some variant of that. And a lot of those are filtered by your email provider. So, you know, Cisco's one of the many vendors that makes the types of systems that block those and detect those. They're particularly important for banks and other people like that trying to detect those, and will AI is used in almost every one of those systems now to try and block and reduce those. But that doesn't mean you don't still get those. The attackers can see both sides. They can try and send a banned message. They have a normal email. They can see whether it gets through. So it's a real cat and mouse game, but that's certainly happening there. And certainly AI is a technique that can be used by all of the platforms that we're talking about here to detect LLM content and then try and figure out what to do with it. What they want to do with it, what they'll decide to do with it is a different thing. They don't want their users all leaving because they fell into some huge scam. That's not their goal, right? Their goal is to keep their users staying there. But that said, they're obviously letting lots of that type of data through completely with sort of full knowledge of it. And it's hard to describe, or it's hard to decide at what level, how much can they do that just with AI? How much do they do that with humans? I think most of the platforms have large moderation teams, but obviously not large in any sense compared to the volume of data they're putting through. Right? That's the problem.
Sophie, if I can sort of ask you to put your Human Rights Commission hat or lens on for a moment. I guess the conversations that we are used to having are about, the individual or the group against a corporation or a government, something terrible that happened or something good that should be done. What about if we're discussing systems? How does an individual or a small group maintain its own rights against a system that's not necessarily controlled by one corporation or regulated clearly by a government?
I think, that is a really interesting question, and certainly how I look at these issues. And I think, we, as a human rights lawyer, we are really looking to the regulation that's coming out, because I guess I wanted to sneak back to one point before I get into this question, but I think, Hamish, you talked about regulation versus innovation. So regulation will stymie innovation. And I think one thing that we're moving beyond that, move fast and break things. And I think that's a really important shift that has happened. And there have been a few moments where we have woken up to the human rights impact. I would call it a human rights impact. At the Human Technology Institute, we talk about the humans in that. And I think that we are moving beyond really having that understanding of the choices that we have. That will be a human rights perspective as well. I think it's also, I often feel, like as a layperson in the area that I'm working in, that the big companies are running the show. I think that often feels like that. And that's where human rights is a really important framework to bring to this, because we can demand of governments for our human rights to be protected. I might just step back just a little bit, because when I talk about human rights, I talk about it really practically. Like, I am a human rights lawyer, I worked at the Human Rights Commission, and when we bring this framing and when we talk to government about how we think regulation should happen, we talk about the human rights obligations we have under international human rights law. And they're all the things that people may not think about so much, but that's what protects our democracy. It's what protects our human autonomy and our dignity. Protects our right to privacy. We've had a lot of chats about that. So I think, now I can't remember your original question, Hamish. This happens to me.
Well, I guess
really
I was just trying to ask really whether there's a distinction in your mind in that sort of scenario between, say, companies, institutions, governments, and then systems that are not necessarily controlled by any one business or regulated by a government.
Yeah, I mean that is true, and I think it's a really good distinction to make, that we are making decisions about how technology is used in these systems. But I think although there is not one particular entity in what you're talking about that is in control of everything, I think we are in control of how this technology is used and how it impacts us. And that's why, as a human rights lawyer, you would look to government to step in, or to our incredible regulators to step in and to look at the system as a whole. I think it's a really good point you make as well, to think about technology as being part of socio-technical systems. Like, we've had a lot of chats about existential risk, for example. The world is going to end, which is particularly unhelpful, because we need to go back to how we're making decisions about technology, how we're understanding our current laws. Like, we've spoken about a lot about laws that might be coming and how we can regulate. We have laws in Australia that already apply, and this is not the Wild West where there's no legislation. So I think we need to bear that in mind as well.
So thinking about that future, do you reckon the 14-year-olds of today that are about to have their TikTok withdrawn might have a different view of this stuff and about what human rights are?
I hope so. I think we are seeing a turn. I have a tween at home, so we have been discussing this very topic, and there's quite a lot that has to be worked out with the social media ban, and go back to the positives of, there are positive social media, and I think that sometimes has been lost in this debate. There are human rights that are protected, there are safe spaces for particularly marginalised teens. The e-Safety Commissioner has spoken about this, so we need to think carefully about how we ban, also about the impact of what technology is used. We don't know yet what that ban is going to look like in practice, and what that's going to mean for all our human rights, particularly our right to privacy. But I think we have a new generation. We have an opportunity here. They're talking about technology a lot differently now than they were even a few years ago. So there are shifts definitely happening.
So I'm just going to let you know that we will take some questions soon. We've got 2 microphones ready to roam around the room. So if you have got a question, you can just raise your hand and we'll try and get to you very soon. I wonder if I can ask you for positive ideas and solutions, answers to... We've talked a lot about problems. So briefly, I'm going to go to you first, Monica, put you on the spot, since you're still a journalist. A solution, an answer.
Well, in the first place, whilst newsrooms are kind of grappling with an increasingly sophisticated kind of generic AI, at the same time as looking down the barrel of generative AI, that they think very, very carefully about the editorial guardrails that they need to put in place. And the positive is that I believe, based on the research that Michael and I are doing at the CMT, that is in fact happening, that they do think very, very seriously about it. And so that's a positive. And the second positive would be, well, it's a wishful thing, but that they all kind of let down their competitive barriers and start to work together to find solutions.
I know, you've been out of the game too long, Monica. Karina.
From a media point of view, I think the first step is to actually be telling their readers and listeners when they're using AI would be a great enhancement to trust. And I think we all find that we go on social media and you see something and you think, oh, no, it's not true, it's fake. Is it not? The whole trust paradigm is breaking down for those reasons. And I note that one of the other bills that the government is trying to get through this week, and probably will, is the Electoral Reform Communications Bill, which is not the one that's been discussed about donations. And it actually has in there, right at the end of the bill, it's a truth in advertising bill, but right at the end of the bill, it has actually a requirement on for political advertising in the future, in the tag, to declare whether it's been made with AI. So I think from a media point of view, tell us when you're using AI, tell us how you're using AI.
Is this the bill that Clive Palmer doesn't like?
I would suspect Clive Palmer doesn't like it. In fact, I don't think any of the crossbenchers are too keen on it.
Cullen, a solution.
Sorry, that's not true. They don't like the political donations bill. This is a separate bill. This is truth in advertising.
Cullen.
Truth in advertising sounds good. So I think I agree that probably some low-hanging fruit that could make progress of industry and research and government working together is figuring out how to clearly identify generative or AI-generated content. I think that sort of watching the Digital Market Acts in Europe and how it actually forced a bunch of companies to work together and trying to do something. It's mostly around interoperable messaging, but I think that's an interesting model where I saw something that was happening in a regulatory environment really caused companies to do something to work together that actually made things better for all of their users. And this is actually a sort of low-hanging fruit of probably making it better for all users. Now, in the not so low-hanging fruit, I think we move into probably a lot of these problems, like we were talking about the thing here that like truth spreads extremely slowly and fake news or false news spreads very quickly, or as often does, is easy to do that way. That comes back to the algorithms people are using to decide what to put on things. And I think that regulators asking for more transparency about how those algorithms work, demanding more choice that users could select extremely basic algorithms in some cases, might be an area that's actually possible to regulate and is not low-hanging fruit, but would have a huge impact. And I think that comes to the sort of my last point that I think is a good thing for them to work together, is that it's very hard to know. It's easy to enumerate. There's been great work on the risks and all the problems and the different scams and the economic losses and the 3 areas you just outlined. But what to do about them is much harder. And there's some stuff that's you can regulate and make a change, and there's some stuff that probably won't change the large tech companies at all, because they'll just dissipate the risk off to someone else, and you'll never be able to figure out where the problem was. So working with the researchers in policy, but also the researchers in AI, the large tech companies and the regulators, trying to figure out what is regulatable, what things could make a difference. I think that's one of the other areas that would be very promising to see work in.
Sophie.
Can I sneak in 2 things? One thing I would say, just quickly, I'm going to struggle to spin this as a positive, but privacy reform I think is really important. This is all our personal information is being used to send us particular information. So I would say that is legislation, that regulation again, that may go through this week, that has been really well consulted on for years, and that I think is really important and positive, where government has gone the hard yards and really spoken and consulted properly over several years. That's really good reform. I'd also sneak in, if anyone's feeling a bit despondent, the Taiwanese digital minister, someone called Audrey Tang, has done some pretty incredible things in countering disinformation in Taiwan. I go and read some really interesting approaches that actually haven't involved law, but have involved people and education. They have, I was reading today, really interestingly, they have a team in each government department, and when there's something that's going viral that is, false information, they have a team that has to spring into gear within 60 minutes and produce that counter-narrative across all types of different forums, whether that be the president speaking on a chat show on TV or going out on social media. So that, I think we're fortunate that we can draw from overseas examples. It's that kind of thinking that I think is the positive and exciting aspect of an otherwise quite grim conversation.
Michael.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I'd actually raise the work of the Australian Electoral Commission here too in Australia, which has taken exactly that kind of approach with electoral misinformation and disinformation in the lead up to elections and the voice referendum and so on. A really engaged approach which meets social media users where they are, and in a kind of sometimes light-hearted way as well, tries to dispel some of the the illusions that they have about the fragility of electoral processes or electoral fraud and so on, and that really does work very well. And I think that's also a sign for traditional media. If we go back to the conversation that you and Monica were having, Hamish, about trust there, and what traditional media has perhaps lost. And I think what it doesn't quite have on the social media environment is that engagement and that ability to be there with the users and to be part of a user group, essentially. And in a kind of slightly disturbing follow on from that, some studies have shown that people actually trust chatbots more than they trust people. And you might think, well, that's awful, but that actually raises some potentially quite good uses. And in fact, there was a study which tried to counteract false beliefs about vaccines, for example, by using chatbots where people would interact with the chatbot, and it would have a conversation with them in a way that a lot of us might be frustrated by if we tried to have that conversation with a vaccine skeptic or by someone that we're politically opposed to, for example. Conversation quickly breaks down, and in fact, we might find that there's an actual information positive use for AI.
All right, let's try and get to some of the questions. I saw lots of hands go up, so perhaps if we get a microphone to this gentleman at the front, and if you can tell us your name, please, and make it a fairly quick question, please. This fellow here.
Hi, my name is Yun Chin Ma. Very interesting. Thank you for this informative. I'm just wondering why none of the panel has mentioned about this defamation law and all that, because those are the ones that ancient law that's there to protect the damage. It could be, in my opinion, generalized to handle the new AI situation, because it's like, listen to this counter and attacking each other using AI is fine. It's like in the old Wild West day that
Okay,
the gun
so
is.
what's the question?
My question is, why is our panel doesn't look at, or the government doesn't look at the defamation as a model to generalize and to modernize so that any damage, tangible or intangible to a person can be identified and someone can sue another person as well as the actor can be identified and the enabler accessory like the platform.
Understood. All right, we'll take our next question as well and we'll get some others. There's a gentleman here with his hand up in the blue, light blue.
Yes, thank you so much for this discussion. It's really interesting as somebody who's studying media and law at the moment. I wanted to ask about Meta. So it's worth $1 trillion USD on the American stock exchange. If there was a proposal to make it reveal its algorithm, and its algorithm is its intellectual property, which is underpinning its whole net worth and its market capitalization, why would Meta not just pull out of Australia like it did with the News Media Bargaining Code, because it would be too much at stake for it to reveal the IP and potentially lose market share if another business comes around copying its IP.
Did you want to have a go at that, Cullen?
So I don't work for Meta, so but let me take a quick stab at this. No, I think you're right that they would not want to fully reveal their whole algorithm. I think that they would be possible to allow people to put user choice in their algorithms. In fact, they were mandated to do that in some places in Europe where they got a very different feed and you had to pay a monthly fee for it. So they have already done this a little bit in the past. But revealing statistics about their algorithm, I think they'd be very willing to do, well, not very willing to do, they could do without impacting their market cap in any way. And the allowing people to have some choice in algorithms could happen under some circumstances. They've already bridged into that space. So I think that that's somewhat there. No, I don't think that they're going to open source their algorithm. And look, we watched the US ask TikTok to do exactly that, and they basically declined, right? So I think that would be a similar experience for Meta.
Karina, were you wanting to add something to that?
No, except it's the really thorny issues, jurisdictional issues, and I think every part of the Australian government is looking at it. But you're right, if you want to operate a business in Australia, you need to comply with Australian law. But a lot of it is about acceding to the jurisdiction. But I just want to say on defamation, I mean, it's just too clumsy. It's partly the problem. I mean, Twiggy Forrest has been trying to sue Meta for your chicken shop problems and in interviews, and is failing and is trying to run his case through California, which goes to jurisdictional issues again. Again, it's a bit like duty of care. I think duty of care is a great idea, but it's going to be slow, and defamation's slow. That's the problem.
When you say this is the ongoing issue, the jurisdictional issue, I mean, is the government conceding? Obviously, there was an attempt to rein in X earlier in the year. Is the government effectively conceding that it can't? Because, I mean, we blinked, didn't we, ultimately in that case?
I think you're talking about the Safety Commission case. I mean, I can't talk to it because I'm not across it. No, I don't think the government has. No, they're not conceding the ground. No.
So look, to your point, to the question I think you're asking, I think there are things that many of the large tech companies would walk away from the Australian market versus do. That is a fact. I mean, end-to-end encryption is probably one of them, right? And so that is true. But if you can work with other governments and make it worldwide, that's a bigger question.
All right, let's take another question. There's a lady at the front here. We'll get the microphone to you as quickly as we can. If you could state your name and maybe direct your question to whoever you want.
Yeah, hi, I'm Helen Botchbeck. I'm glad we've got two ABC people here, former and current. But don't worry, I won't ask you any hard questions. I was very interested to hear that in Taiwan they're focusing on educating the public, and I also feel that education will play a very key role because we can't control these corporations. What can control them, however, is market share. So if people become sick and tired of being scammed or just don't enjoy the experience anymore, people will turn away. So the corporations need us to be engaged, and we'll be engaged when we trust what we're getting. So it can be a two-way thing. So if we can build up trust from a school age, but also for adults and so on,
Yep.
and I can really see a role for our public broadcaster to help us understand. So to expand the role of the ABC, to educate us on what we're being exposed to.
I'll put this to Monica.
Sounds like it's one for you, actually, Hannah.
I can't comment on behalf of anyone. I mean, I've actually just been in Finland and met the education minister there, where they're teaching mis and disinformation from primary school age up, and they say that it's having quite a massive impact on the broader...
And I think we're pretty slow, we're as we are on many, many issues, but media literacy, I think, is a really good example of it, where we now talk about media literacy beginning at a very young age. We're talking about it for older people who tend to be on Facebook, for example, because that's not where young people live. We're talking about it now, but we're only just talking about it. It's only been the last 4 or 5 years, I think, that we've taken it quite seriously. But it is something, I agree with you, it's something that has to happen from a very, very early age, and then again at a very, very late age for people who are, post 60 or maybe post 70, whose well-being is tied to their presence, for example, on Facebook, and who are being scammed and who, don't understand what they're reading. And of course, if Meta does end up pulling out of news in Australia, which is quite possible, that problem is just going to worsen. So it is something that we need to look at.
All right, we'll get to a couple more questions. There's some hands at the back. So there's a lady in the middle there. Can you get the microphone to her? Yep. Thanks. What's your name and what's your question and who's it for?
I'm Chloe. This is just kind of for whoever can answer it, but do you believe that AI will have an impact on surveillance capitalism and data mining on social media sites, and therefore on politics and democracy in the future?
How about you have a go at that, Sophie?
Yes, I think that is the answer. You've really hit on the business model that we were talking about before. I think the shift, maybe I can tie a few of those questions together actually, about that interaction with individuals, and speaking about young people, digital literacy and the liability question. I think there is some really, when I said before, I think we're having a shift, I think we are. So we, at least we understand now what the models are. So when we talk about surveillance capitalism, we all now understand that we are not getting things for free. I think that came with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where we realised that all this personal information we're feeding into these platforms is being used because it's being monetised. So I think we are stepping towards an understanding. I think that's been really important for all of us to understand, and for everyone to say, we're not so cool with that anymore. The other thing, just on earlier questions of talking about liability, I think someone had the gentleman had a question there about, there's some really interesting cases, I think, that are coming out of the US that are really looking to pin liability for social media harm. So I think what we are going to, very sadly, I think, we're talking about a recent case I've been reading about that involved suicide of someone who got enamoured with a chatbot and character AI. So I think where we are moving towards is getting the understanding of how these systems, how we're interacting with these systems, and B, we're getting to some harder edged questions about liability. Who is responsible for producing products? Because if you buy a chatbot, it becomes a product, not just a platform dispensing information. So I think that ties into having that understanding and having some guardrails in place. So yes, it's having a huge impact. I think we are stepping towards making sure it doesn't have such a negative, adverse impact on all of us in the protection of our human rights.
Okay, one last question. There's a gentleman right next to the microphone, so we might just a few rows back, just there. Yeah, either of these two guys. You take your pick. Your name, who your question's for, and please keep it.
Okay. Greg Porter's my name. I became the IT director at UTS in 1991. In early '92, I got a call from the Australian Federal Police to interview a student who'd managed, with a mate, had managed to hack into a couple of small US government departments like US Defence and NASA.
It's a good training at UTS, obviously.
Quite clearly,
what's
yes.
your question?
One more second about that, but a few years later I also had a visit from the politically motivated violent crime squad on behalf of the US Secret Service. One of the students had happened to threaten Clinton and his wife and blow up the World Trade Center. Life as an IT director at a university is a lot of fun. What I learned at that time was that our behaviour on the net is quite different to our behaviour in real life. And our sense of values is quite different. And that is the essence of the problem that we actually have. And there's no, and people have mentioned accountability for what we do. I think we've actually, the horse has already bolted, but somebody mentioned the case in Melbourne, for instance, with Channel 9 down there. It seems to, the case there seems to fit the Australian government definition of negligence. So we've got a whole lot of opportunities to press home accountability, but it seems to me we're not doing it. Now, I know we are in a lot of cases, but it seems to me we're doing lots of good stuff, don't get me wrong. The behavioural problem is still there. How can we improve that? But we need to have law actually be more active.
How do we improve it? That was the question.
I might jump in on this one. Look, I think that's true. Humans are often not nice people, right? But the problem is, which of our characteristics are promoted online? And I think you've put your finger on it, and it goes back to a point from Cullen as well, is that often we find that engagement-driven algorithms pick up on that negative behaviour rather than the positive behaviour. If I go back to a point in the presentation from the beginning about the last best place on the internet, Wikipedia is quite different from Twitter or Facebook. It's a community where people come together in a kind of old school internet way. They have a common goal to promote knowledge and to promote open and free knowledge. And obviously it has problems. Obviously there are conflicts as well between users, but on the whole it gets along fine, just as we remember, if we do remember, what the internet was like in 2003 or 4 or 5, right? It was a better place back then in that sense. So there is a room for accountability for social media platforms and other digital platforms to make them accountable for what René DeResta calls the infrastructure of influence, right? Which is the way that algorithms interact with human behaviour, interact with different actors online, malicious actors, and so on. And to certainly distribute accountability where it deserves to be distributed. Digital platforms are not responsible for all online problems. Users are responsible for some, but it's how the interaction occurs that is really the key here. And I think what we're finding is that the regulatory approach is kind of treating a lot of symptoms and trying to treat them all at once in a kind of piecemeal way. And really we need to get to the nub of the issue, which is a general accountability for digital platforms, for AI companies, and so on, about the risks that they present to the public and to individuals.
We are going to have to leave it there. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Would you please thank Monica Attard, Karina Chapman, Cullen Jennings, Sophie Farthing, and Michael Davis. Please put your hands together. And thanks for coming tonight. Have a great evening. Good night.